the archaeological community. Dan is particularly unhappy with the Society for American Archaeology and made his objections to the organization very clear in an open letter to President-elect Donald Trump, which he posted on Twitter on the 29th of December 2024. In this letter, he describes the SAA as, quote, a well-respected body of scientists that is clearly corrupted by political influences, end quote, which, quote, uses millions in government funds every year, as well as holding an advisory role to the federal government, end quote. Dan's letter contains various objections to the SAA, which I'll address in another video, but in this video, I want to examine his claims that the SAA, quote, receives large amounts of federal funding, end quote. He asserts, quote, in the fiscal year of 2023, the SAA requested over $450 million from the Senate Committee on Appropriations, end quote, and objects, quote, they are using taxpayer funds to promote their political agendas under the guise of science, end quote. Dan's letter asks Trump, quote, to remove the Society for American Archaeology from its advisory role to the United States government and to reduce or remove their federal funding, end quote. The problem with all this is that Dan is wrong because he doesn't understand the SAA or how archaeology is funded in the US. The SAA is not federally funded, doesn't use millions of dollars of government funds every year, has never requested $450 million from the State Committee on Appropriations, and is a private organization which raises its own funds. Dan's letter is a complete waste of time because it is asking Donald Trump to do the impossible. Not even the president can stop or reduce federal funding which doesn't exist. Dan's claims about the SAA's role and funding. I'm going to start by quoting Dan's various claims in detail without commentary or pushback so you can see how he made his case in his own words. In the process, I'll not only quote from Dan's open letter, but also from tweets he made in response to people critiquing his view, tweets in which he explained himself in more detail than in the letter, and tweets in which he appealed to sources of evidence which he believed substantiated his claims. Dan states his main objection by saying, quote, the status of the SAA as an advisory body to the United States federal government and their associated federal funding is why I write this letter. Coupled with their frequent and blatant penchant for injecting their political bias into their statements, their status as an advisory body is not deserved, in my estimation, end quote. As I mentioned previously, Dan's letter contains several objections to the SAA, but in this video I'll respond to his claims about the SAA's funding. Dan states, quote, this body receives large amounts of federal funding. In the fiscal year of 2023, the SAA requested over $450 million from the Senate Committee on Appropriations. They are using taxpayer funds to promote their political agendas under the guise of science, end quote. He didn't provide any evidence for this in his letter, or in the video he made for his YouTube channel in which he read his letter and explained it in more detail. However, on Twitter, he not only expanded on his claims about SAA funding in a number of tweets on the 30th to the 31st of December 2024, he also cited documentation which he believed supported his claims. In one tweet, he claimed, quote, almost all non-commercial archaeological funding in the US goes through them, end quote, that is, the SAA. In another tweet, he repeated this claim, stating, quote, the majority of the funding comes from the SAA, end quote. In another tweet, he explained how he thinks this works, claiming, quote, the SAA gets all the national park archaeological funds and that sort of thing, then it drip feeds the places that need it, end quote, adding, quote, not like I just did research on this or anything, end quote. So according to Dan, he actually did research on this, which sounds good. So what kind of research did he do? What source did he use? In another tweet, Dan actually cited a source, stating, quote, the SAA's fiscal year reports are available on their website, with a breakdown of what it's for, end quote. That's very useful, and we'll check that soon. Finally, Dan's letter asks Trump, quote, to remove the Society for American Archaeology from its advisory role to the United States government and to reduce or remove their federal funding, end quote. Now let's find out why Dan's letter is asking Trump to do the impossible, because Dan doesn't understand the facts about the SAA's advisory role or its funding. Dan doesn't understand the SAA or its funding. Dan's request for, quote, removal of the SAA from its advisory role to the US government, end quote, is nonsensical since it's based on a false premise. It's equivalent to someone else asking Trump to remove Dan's ability to write a letter to the president. Dan doesn't seem to realize that the SAA does not hold an official or government-appointed role as an advisory body. The SAA is an advisory body to the United States federal government in the same capacity as any other private or non-profit organization. Private organizations such as various non-profit organizations and non-government organizations send the government advisory letters all the time. Although they are acting in an advisory role, the government is in no way obligated to pay any attention to their requests. But for the president to deny them the right to send such letters would be a breach of their rights, according to US legislation. Individual citizens can perform the same advisory role. In fact, Dan's letter to Donald Trump is advising the federal government in exactly the same way as the SAA does. As for Dan's mistaken understanding of the SAA's funding, several people on Twitter corrected Dan in an effort to help him realize how the SAA is actually funded. Archaeologist Reed Farmer replied to Dan, explaining, quote, the SAA doesn't take any money from the government. It's funded by member dues, publication sales, and conference registrations. This is clearly shown in their IRS filings of Form 990, end quote. That should have prompted Dan to pause and check his facts. However, instead of reading the IRS filing, Dan simply ignored that and responded, quote, that doesn't account for the nearly $500 million a year they beg from the feds, end quote, linking to an SAA document entitled Statement of the Society for American Archaeology for Fiscal Year 2023 Appropriations. Since Dan claims this document shows the SAA requesting nearly $500 million of funding from the federal government a year, let's read it and see if he's right. The document, dated 26th of May 2022, opens with the statement, quote, the Society for American Archaeology, SAA, once again appreciates this opportunity to present its recommendations for fiscal year 2023 Cultural Resources Program appropriations for the Department of Interior and USDA Forest Service, end quote. That phrase, present its recommendations for fiscal year 2023 Cultural Resources Program appropriations, means the purpose of this document is to give the federal government the SAA's suggestions on how the government should spend its cultural resource program money. The SAA is not requesting any money from the government. It is suggesting how the government should spend its own cultural resource program funds by giving them to government departments and services. I don't know how Dan read that very first paragraph and understood it as saying something totally different to what it actually says. However, perhaps he was confused by the wording of phrases later in the document, such as, quote, we request an additional $10 million in financial year 2023 for interior archaeologist positions, end quote, and, quote, the SAA requests a total of $36 million for financial year 2023, an increase of $1.6 million, end quote. Although these phrases might sound like the SAA is asking the federal government to give the SAA money, in reality, it is asking the government to allocate these funds to government departments and services, such as the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Land Management. This money would be going directly from the federal government to these government departments and services. It would not be going to the SAA or going through the SAA to drip feed these government departments and services. This is made much clearer by the other phrases the SAA uses when advising on government spending. For example, quote, the SAA strongly endorses the recommendations put forward by the preservation community for a total of $200 million for the HPF in financial year 2023, end quote. Meaning the SAA is supporting the spending recommendation of the preservation community for federal spending of $200 million for the National Park Preservation Fund. As another example, quote, the SAA requests an increase of $1.8 million for BLM Cultural Resources Management, end quote. This is a request for the Bureau of Land Management's Cultural Resource Management budget to be increased, nothing to do with money being given to the SAA. Again, quote, We respectfully request that the National NAGPRA Grants Program receive $2.3 million for financial year 2022, end quote. I think that should be 2023. A request for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act's grant program to have its budget increased. Nothing to do with money being given to the SAA. Not once in this entire document does the SAA ask the government for any money for itself. I honestly do not understand how Dan misunderstood this letter so badly. Now let's look at the SAA's Form 990 filing for the fiscal year of 2023, a financial declaration to the Internal Revenue Service reporting the SAA's income and expenditure as a Section 501c3 non-profit organisation. According to Dan, this should show millions of dollars of government funding being received by the SAA, as well as the drip-feed disbursement of this funding from the SAA to various government departments and services such as the National Park, as well as non-government organisations. Remember, Dan said, quote, the SAA gets all the National Park archaeological funds and that sort of thing, then it drip-feeds the places that need it, end quote, claimed the SAA receives millions of dollars in government funding every year, and that the SAA requested $450 million of federal funding for 2023. Let's see if there's any evidence for this in the SAA's Form 990. Since the SAA's Form 990 is a public document, I went to the ProPublica website, an investigative journalism website which indexes information such as non-profit organisation tax filings, located the SAA's Form 990, downloaded it, and read it. You could get the Form 990 from other sources. I just find ProPublica a useful resource for this kind of information. On the first page, I read that gross receipts for the year 2023 were $4,489,565. That's dramatically lower than $450 million, so maybe the government rejected the SAA's request for $500 million, or maybe Dan just doesn't understand the SAA's funding and never read the Form 990 to check the facts. Next, I looked at the section recording income from contributions and grants, which would include any government funding. The form reported $670,586 for 2022 and $453,295 for 2023. This means that out of the SAA's gross receipts of $4,489,565 for 2023, only $453,295 was from contributions and grants. Even if all of that money was from the federal government, that's still not $450 million, the money Dan claimed the SAA was asking for, and nowhere near the millions a year which Dan claimed the SAA receives from federal funding. Where did he get those figures from? Next, I moved down to Part 8, Statement of Revenue, to examine the detailed breakdown of the contributions and grants for 2023. Where did this $453,295 come from? How much was from the government? Happily, Part 8 clearly identifies the SAA's government funding for 2023, and it's very different from what Dan claimed. There's no federal funding here. Instead, we find government grants. This is not annual federal funding disbursed on request by the SAA. This is money for which the SAA, like any other organisation, must apply to the government and for which specific criteria must be met. How much money did the SAA receive from government grants in 2023? Well, it wasn't millions of dollars. It wasn't even hundreds of thousands. It was $19,800. That's how much the government gave the SAA in 2023. Not $450 million, as Dan claimed the SAA had requested, though now we know they never made such a request, and not even the more vague millions of dollars a year, which Dan claimed the SAA receives in annual federal funding. Instead, the SAA received a pitiful $19,800 in government grants, for which it had to apply just like any other organisation or any individual. Part 8 of the Form 990 also tells us that in 2023 the SAA received $433,495 from, quote, all other contributions, gifts, grants, and similar amounts not included above, end quote. So the overwhelming majority of the SAA's money from contributions, gifts, and grants in 2023 came from non-government sources. So let's review Dan's claims. The SAA, quote, uses millions in government funds every year, end quote. False. The SAA, quote, receives large amounts of federal funding, end quote. False. Quote, in the fiscal year of 2023, the SAA requested over $400 million from the Senate Committee on Appropriations, end quote. False. Quote, almost all non-commercial archaeological funding in the US goes through them, end quote. False. Quote, the majority of the funding comes from the SAA, end quote. False. Quote, the SAA gets all the national park archaeological funds and that sort of thing, then it drip feeds the places that need it, end quote. False. These claims have been seen by thousands of people via Dan's Twitter account and YouTube channel, but they are all false. If Dan retracts these claims, that will be great, but I would hope the same people who saw the original claims also see the retraction. Why Dan makes these mistakes. Previously, I made a video describing how Dan made mistakes when recommending a journal article which he believed was a legitimate scholarly publication which had passed proper academic peer review. In that video, I explained how and why Dan made his mistakes, and now I'll do the same for this case. If you want to see that video, see the video description. It's easy to attribute Dan's false claims about the SAA's funding to simple bias. He definitely isn't a fan of the organization, and his status as an alternate historian and self-described pseudoscientist does place him in conflict with them. But I don't think bias alone is sufficient to explain this situation. Dan is fully aware of his bias, and if he was simply writing out of bias, he wouldn't have gone to the trouble of looking for evidence to support his claims. He would have simply assumed he was correct. Nevertheless, I will say that bias played a part because when Dan was corrected directly about the SAA's funding and directed to the Form 990, which plainly proved his claims wrong, he just dismissed it as irrelevant and assumed he was still right. One demonstrable cause of Dan's errors in this case is simply lack of knowledge. He just did not know what he was talking about. He had no understanding of the SAA's relation to the government, or any understanding of its funding sources, or any understanding of how the federal government funds archaeology in the US. Although he did seek out evidence for the SAA's funding, he looked in the wrong place, and when he read the SAA's statement for fiscal year 2023 appropriations, he did not understand what he was reading. No one with proper knowledge of these topics would make the mistakes he did. But the most influential factor contributing to Dan's errors is the fact that on this occasion, as on many others, he simply did not do the work required to ensure his claims were accurate. I've watched at least 75% of Dan's videos and read countless tweets from him, and a recurring pattern I've noticed is that he tends to form his views on his initial impression of the situation, typically from a narrow perspective, then produces strong claims on the situation which extrapolate well beyond the evidence he supplies. And sometimes he doesn't even cite any evidence. He cites his sources more frequently than other pseudo-archaeologists I've seen, which is commendable, but very often he doesn't even do that. And very often, when I check his sources, they don't support his claims, and he doesn't even realize this. Frequently, he accompanies his claims with a rough sketch of why he thinks they are right, but doesn't put in the work to demonstrate this. It's well received by his audience, since they're already primed to think the same way he does, so he can make certain claims about X being connected to Y without doing the hard work necessary to establish the connection. He can claim the SAA receives millions of dollars of federal funding a year, and that they begged the federal government for $450 million in 2023, without ever presenting any evidence that he has carried out reliable research to confirm this is true, and his audience will just accept this without fact-checking it, or even commenting on the fact that he hasn't shown how he arrived at this conclusion. It already confirms their prior beliefs, so they'll simply treat it as true. He can say to his audience, look, here's evidence this professional archaeologist has directed people to a Wikipedia article on a hypothesis he disagrees with, and here's evidence he has edited the article himself, so he's being dishonest. Now the article reads the way he wants it to read because he has corrupted it. You can't trust this article, and you can't trust Wikipedia either. And his audience will just accept all this without noticing or caring that he hasn't done the work to prove that the archaeologist's edits were a corruption, or that the article reads exactly the way he wants it to, or that the article is inaccurate to the point that it can't be trusted. let alone that Wikipedia as a whole can't be trusted. There's a whole lot of work he hasn't done which he should have done, but he knows he doesn't need to because his audience will accept him at face value without fact-checking him because they share his biases. And yes, as the video thumbnail I've placed on screen indicates, that's not a hypothetical. Dan has made a video with precisely that claim about an archaeologist and Wikipedia, and I'll get to that in another video of my own. See the video description if you want to watch that video of his. It has taken me over 3 hours just to write this script, and many more hours to fact-check Dan's claims by identifying, locating, reading, and analysing the relevant sources, and double-checking my understanding by consulting knowledgeable professionals in relevant fields. It will take me several more hours just to produce this video. Doing proper research is time-consuming. This is why it's easy to be a pseudo-archaeologist or alternate historian. You don't even need to do the work. You could create a YouTube channel, make bold claims, sweeping generalizations, unsubstantiated assertions, and rely on your audience to ignore the fact that you haven't established an evidence-based chain of logical reasoning, to skip over the gaps in your argument, to assume you're right without requiring you to demonstrate it. And that's another reason why you can't trust pseudo-archaeologists. They just don't do the work. If you want to know if they're reliable in any given instance, you end up doing the work for them.